And we're live. Welcome, folks. Sorry about the slight delay there. I didn't realize we were already live. It's my browser. Random Acoustic Thoughts. I've got my special guest here, the boxing librarian from Hardline Boxing Talk. We're just here to do a brief recap of a project that BL just finished. BL, what you been up to, man?
I resolved to look at the issue of Jack Johnson versus Sam Langford based on the heavyweight resume, because whether it on YouTube or Facebook or wherever I go in internet forums, there seems to be a massive underestimation of Sam Langford's heavyweight career. So I set out to resolve it. I did do a big breakdown over 2 parts. I think it was nearly 2 hours, 20 minutes long in total. And I could have gone further, but I decided that what I'd shared were more than enough to sell my point. And what I wanted to do specifically is focus on Langford's heavyweight work, because that is the point of contention to many people. Many people say, well, he's a greater pound for pounder, but Johnson's a greater heavyweight. And I've always gone against that, saying, no, Langford's work at heavyweight, you are underrating. So that is why I resolved to do that project.
Yeah, that made for a great listen. Would you say there's anything? Sorry, go ahead.
If you don't mind me asking, what were your thoughts on it then? Was it as you expected, or did it surprise you in any way, his sheer level of work at heavyweight alone? Or
well, we've ourselves done a project on Langford, or several things that touch on his career, and I'd actually, for a project with 86 Boxing, we had begun to do the rivalry between Langford and Johnson, the actual fight they had in '06, but also then the subsequent years of people trying to match them together for a second go. Mm-hmm. So I'm actually somewhat familiar with Johnson's career as well as Langford's, but it was just so lovely to see them next to each other. And then you went through I like that, going through the rivalries, common opponents and the different series.
Yeah. One thing about that, a lot of people, and one of my real bugbears when it comes to boxing and how people look at boxing careers, it really does bug me, is when people say this kind of thing that, Bearcat Wright bet Jack Johnson, at his best when he didn't, or this and that. Choyinski beat Jack Johnson at his best when he technically didn't. That's always really irritated me, because I remember a conversation I had where someone said that Lennox Lewis beating Mike Tyson, he has to get credit as beating prime Mike Tyson. And I remember saying, what planet are you on? He didn't beat prime Mike Tyson. He bet an old, jaded, well past it Mike Tyson, with no head movement, no rapid fire combinations, nothing. But he was insistent that Lewis had to get full credit for beating prime Mike Tyson because of how he rated Lennox Lewis. It was one of his justifications behind that. And another reason why I did it as I did it and went through the common opponents is also not only to highlight that Langford bears most of common opponents at heavyweight. There were a few in there not at heavyweight. Langford fought Jackson at middleweight, around that weight, and he fought Ketchel at middleweight. But virtually most other opponents were all at heavyweight, and Langford still bettered Jack Johnson. And that's why I pointed out in my breakdown that, like with McVeigh and Jeanette, he beat those guys more in their experienced prime, so to speak, when they were very experienced, had been through hard battles, had learnt the craft. Beating Sam McVeigh in his first 12 fights 3 times, he's beaten Sam McVeigh 3 times. But if you can beat the Sam McVeigh of 1910 to 1913 3 times, then I am going to give that more credit, because he's fighting a better, stronger, more experienced version of Sam McVeigh. And a lot of boxing fans really don't give Langford that credit when it comes to Jack Johnson. They look at names on a ledger and just say, well, he bet them. It's like people say, well, Johnson beat Bob Fitzsimmons. Yeah, he beat Bob Fitzsimmons, who'd been a pro like nearly 20 years. He'd been fighting, training, doing exhibitions for like 2 decades. He was not the same Bob Fitzsimmons. He wasn't even the same Bob Fitzsimmons who fought Gardner. He just wasn't quite as good as he was in 1890s. He were already starting to leave his prime and starting his natural decline after his long career. And that's something that's always really got to me. And I've like, no, if someone beats a prime fighter, then you must give them credit for beating the prime fighter over someone who has beaten that fighter either way past the prime or before the Boxing Prime. And that's another thing I wanted to highlight in video, that not only did Langford do more work, but he fought more at Hall of Fame heavyweights in their prime. Another thing I wanted to highlight in video on the non-common opponents, because people on Johnson's side always say Jeffries, he come out of 6-year retirement. Like I said, Ketchel left his training camp saying he's going to get whipped. He has no chance against Johnson. Most boxing insiders thought it were going to be a tough ask because Jeffries wasn't in great shape. He was still overweight. His timing were all off. He didn't have this, he was slower and more ponderous than he was, back in 1900 to 1905. So, people have to start to recognize that. And I also highlighted that as well as fighting those other heavyweight Hall of Famers in the prime, Langford, past his prime, had a dozen fights against Harry Wills. He also fought Harry Wills a number of times on come up. He also fought prime Jeff Clark a whole number of times. And actually, I wanted to highlight that from when they first titled, so mirroring that period, Langford 1909, Johnson 1903 for coloured title, I also wanted to highlight the activity, because the activity is absolutely a monster. Jack Johnson, from when he won coloured heavyweight title, for that time period I covered after that, compared to Langford, I mean, they are not even in the same ballpark. So my big question, like I said at the end of that two-part big project, was, well, what are the reasons why Johnson rates above Langford as a heavyweight? Why does Jack Johnson end up in the top 5, but Langford's not even in the top 10? I mean, I would like answers, really. But they're going to have to come up with very good answers to explain to me why Langford doesn't go in the top 10, but Johnson does.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I rate Langford just slightly above Johnson. Johnson had a great career, and he had some serious wins. And like you said,
Yes, did, yeah.
Beating McVeigh and Jeanette, they were like considered like really good talents, and McVeigh especially. They were saying he was a wonder out in California, stopping guys, and so beating him did mean something. It just meant even more when he was in his absolute prime and he had dozens and dozens of fights under his belt. He knocked out dozens of guys and he traveled around the world. He matured in that time, as Johnson lost before he hit his full stride. He lost to Choinsky, but he got way better after that. By like 1903, when he's beating Denver Ed Martin, and he's able to school guys by like 1903, 1904, and especially by 1908, his ability, regardless of whatever he was at, say, 30 years old, but his ability, skill-wise, is just off the charts. And that's why, even though Langford was this wonder, there was a lot of question. They wanted to see that fight because there was a lot of question about who would actually win between them, because Johnson was bigger and also brilliant. He just didn't hit as hard, but he was considered the cleverer of the two. Maybe just by a bit.
Johnson's first fight with McVeigh were in 1903, and that was McVeigh's 7th pro fight. And his next subsequent 2 fights against Johnson were his 10th and 11th pro fights. Now, it's a similar story with Joe Jeanette as well. Johnson fought him early on during that first insane 22 fight run Jeanette had at the start of his career. So no one, me or you, are not saying they're not good wins. They are good wins. Jack Johnson first fought Jeanette in Jeanette's 4th pro fight. And another really key point I wanted to highlight as well from the Johnson Jeanette fights is Langford were fighting him over. I know he fought an 8-rounder. He lost to Jeanette early on in the rivalry. But for the most part, he were fighting 10, 12, he were fighting 12, 15 or 20 rounders against these guys. He wasn't fighting like 3-rounders. Johnson, his first fight with Joe Jeanette, I think it was a 3-round fight. Then there were the DQ win, what Jeanette got, and then his next fight was a 6-round fight. Then the fight after that was a 3-round fight. And then it was the 5th fight they had, what were actually a 15-round fight. They only had one 15-round fight in that entire 7-fight run. They had a 12-round fight, a 10-round fight, and rest were either 6 or 3 rounds. Whereas Langford were fighting opponents over way better roundage than Jack Johnson was.
Yeah, that's a good point. Langford was scheduled for 10, 15, or 20 many times, and those battles with McVeigh, at least the first 7 were 20-round fights. They were scared. 2 of them didn't make it the distance. Langford stopped in 2 of the 1912 bouts, but 1911, they fought 20 rounds in Paris in April. They fought 20 rounds in, I think, Sydney at the end of the year. Then they fought
Yeah,
four
that's right.
times the
Yeah,
next
yeah.
year. I think it was split between, was it Brisbane and Melbourne or Sydney and Melbourne? I forget. It
I
was two
can't
different
recall
cities.
offhand, but I do know that the first fight in Australia in 1912 was a 20 rounder. I think the second fight was a 20 rounder, and then Langford, I think, stopped him in next two, didn't he? But then the first
I
fight
think
he
he
had with
won the
McVeigh in
first two
1913
of
were 20 rounds
1912.
again.
Yeah, I think he took 20 round decisions twice, and then he stopped him in the last two fights they had of the four in 1912. It's crazy, their series. You really have to narrow it down. You can't even say their second fight. You'd be like, second fight of the year. That's a rivalry, you know? And that's why I put him so highly, because like I try to translate it in my mind over to other heavyweights. And same with Langford. Like, could he do what they do? Like they swam in waters where there were more large guys. It's not like Langford never fought big guys. There are a whole ton of big dudes in other eras, in certain other eras.
Another thing to consider is when Langford first fought Jeanette, it would he was stopped in 8 rounds. But the next time he fought Jeanette in 1906, that would a full 15 rounder, not a 3 or 6 rounder. That would a full 15 rounder. And this would a Jeanette who was again inside that first 22 professional fights. So while Johnson's fighting him in 6 rounders and 3 rounders, Langford in that same time period fights Jeanette in a full 15 round. And Langford is not even a proper heavyweight at that point. That's in 1906. That's before Langford challenges Johnson for coloured heavyweight title, if I recall. So,
if I'm not mistaken, Jeanette was his first heavyweight opponent, and then
yes,
and also his second. So Johnson, he was fighting Johnson. He was a small middleweight, but that was his first season as a middleweight, and he was But yeah, he took it a couple weeks after the Jeanette fight, and then. That was his third heavyweight fight. So later in at the end of 1908, when Johnson's beaten Tommy Burns and he's gone back to America, he's not going to honor the contract to fight Langford in London in May 1909. So he goes back, and it's like he was scary by that point at heavyweight. He was always scary from his very first season. They always thought he was a coming talent, but he was scary to the heavyweights. And so by 1911, he was really in like this mythical status when he's fighting McVeigh, when he's giving up 40 pounds to him in Paris. And, they're fighting in 4-ounce gloves. They're not, at least I saw a report that had been sent back to America, a long article that referenced that. It was a 4-ounce gloves. 20 rounds to a draw. How do you draw when you're giving up a sizable percentage of your body weight and you're not like a heavyweight yourself? Like, he's 160. My goodness.
And it's not only that they fought to a draw, but Langford were able to get McVeigh on the back foot and force him back. I mean, just like McVeigh later with Wills, McVeigh could bully Wills back and bully him and start to impose his strength on him, even though Wills were a much bigger heavyweight in height and length. McVeigh were a very powerfully built, powerfully set guy. So, yeah, it's incredible. But another thing about Johnson's career, in 1909, after he beats Burns at the end of December 1908, he fights O'Brien and gets a draw. Then he beats Kaufman, Ketchel and Ross, I think, that year. But then from then up until 1915, he has one fight in 1910, doesn't even fight in 1911. He's got one fight in 1912, one fight in 1913, one fight in 1914, and one fight in 1915. He only has 5 fights in 6 years.
Yeah, at that point, I guess Johnson was done fighting it was like, we know he was maximizing his money to risk ratio, but yeah, no, he's not fighting like Jeanette, McVeigh and Langford are fighting the series. They want Johnson in on that. But of course he knows well that on any given night that one of them could get the best of him, because they were on that level, and they were actually in their prime. They were younger than him. So that's why he's fighting like Tony Ross and Jack O'Brien, etc.
Yeah, but one of the things I want to highlight is to people, it's not only that he was only having one fight a year, but he wasn't even fighting the better heavyweights that one fight a year. So not only was he having months and months time to rest and then prepare for fights before having his one fight a year, he was also not fighting the best heavyweight contenders available. So he's fighting once a year. He's chilling out all year, then going into training camp for a fight, having the fight, then chilling out until the next year. And he's not even fighting the best heavyweight contenders. I mean, battling Jim Johnson, that were a draw. That were an horrendous fight. There were boos and jeers and everything going on. Fireman Jim Flynn in 90, well, he's already beat him. He's already knocked him out. Fireman Jim Flynn had already been railroaded by a whole number of other better heavyweights at time. And, Frank Moran in 1914, he was not one of the best heavyweight fighters of that time. And it's not only to me, people are so ignorant and don't think this deeply, that in those 6 years when he had 5 fights, he's fighting not subpar, the good fighters, the tough fighters, but they're not the best cream of the cream heavyweights who were available at that time. And I reject all this notion, because she's still here in defense of Johnson. Well, 2 black fighters couldn't fight for heavyweight title in America. But I'm sorry, as Jack Johnson knows, he went to Australia to win the title. Okay, he was in England first and then Chase Burns to Australia. Fights could happen all over the world. People use this excuse that, well, Johnson couldn't fight McVeigh, Jeanette, or Langford because in America they wouldn't allow it. But the rest of the world would allow it. These guys had massive followings. They had a cult following in Paris, did Jeanette and McVeigh. They were well known and well respected there. They had cult followings after, 1911, 1912 series in Australia that McIntosh offered Johnson to join in. He sent Johnson an offer, I think it was $50,000. He would get 20,000, I think. Yeah, he would get 20,000 for fighting McVeigh, and he would get 30,000 for fighting Langford. And that's $50,000 for 2 fights.
Right, and that's what Burns got to fight Johnson. So, I mean, that's a pretty penny. That was the record, I think, for a single fighter's purse at the time. So
yeah,
Johnson
that was
at least tied that record.
Money back then. Because they also used this excuse that, well, Johnson couldn't fight Langford because there's no money in it. No, there was, maybe not in America, but around the world, there was massive money in it. They tried to get McVeigh and Jeanette fighting Johnson in Paris. He balked at those ideas as well. So, I could go on all day. I've done a video, you may have seen it, Johnson, why the Langford Jeanette McVeigh fights didn't happen. And I'm going through articles at time. There's information out there. Johnson just didn't want to give these fighters a shot. And I'm sorry to hurt some people's feelings, but he just did not want to give those guys a shot. And that is it, plain and simple. So while I respect Johnson's career, he is to me a top 5 great heavyweight. I cannot put him above Langford because Langford proved himself by fighting in round robins against the best heavyweights of his era, while Jack Johnson were fighting Frank Moran's and Fireman Jim Flynn's. I'm sorry, but
I agree with that.
To account for that.
But Johnson's pre-unified title run as the colored heavyweight champ, and also the career leading up to 1903 when he beat Dan Ed Martin, was so impressive that he also makes my top 5. I actually have him just below Langford. I have Ali and Joe Louis in some order as the top 2 of all time, strictly at heavyweight. Then I have Langford, Johnson, and Harry Wills, the great Harry Wills, as the next 3 spots, just the way I personally see it. Because the overall career, it's not just about title fights, because not everyone gets the same opportunity. Johnson was trying to get, he was a champion trying to fight the rival champion from 1903 onwards. So he finally got a shot in 1908.
One thing I want to do as well, mate, is I just want to throw some information at people just to give them an idea what I'm talking about. In 1914, Jack Johnson defended his heavyweight title against Frank Moran. That's it. That's all he did. Okay. In 1914, not counting all his opponents, Sam Langford fought battling Jim Johnson, 10-rounder. He fought Harry Wills, 10-rounder. Fought battling Jim Johnson, 10-rounder. Fought battling Jim Johnson, 12-rounder. Fought Joe Jeanette, okay, in a 10-rounder. He fought Gunboat Smith, knocking him out. He fought Jeff Clark in a 10-rounder. And he fought Harry Wills, okay, in a long fight. Can't remember if that was 15 or 20 rounds. That's just 1914 when Johnson fights Moran. In 1915, when Johnson's only fight is Jess Willard, where he loses his heavyweight title, I want people to really hear this. In 1915, Sam Langford fought battling Jim Johnson, Joe Jeanette, battling Jim Johnson, Sam McVeigh, Jack Thompson, Sam McVeigh, battling Jim Johnson, Sam McVeigh, and Harry Wills. In 1 year, when Johnson is just fighting Willard. And 1916, it's even worse. This is last year I'll do, but I'm making a point. 1916, Harry Wills, 20-rounder. Harry Wills, 20-rounder. He knocks him out in 19. Sam McVeigh, 10 rounder. Harry Wills, 10 rounder. Jeff Clark, I think that were a 10 rounder, but he knocked him out. Sam McVeigh, 10 rounder. And continuing in 1916, he then goes on to fight Harry Wills, Sam McVeigh, Joe Jeanette, Sam McVeigh, Bill Tate, battling Jim Johnson. I mean, that 3-year run there completely crushes Jack Johnson's entire title reign in terms of activity, quality of fight, how regular the fights are happening. Many of these fights are 12, 15, 20 rounders. And Langford is winning a large amount of them. And sadly, drawing with Jack O'Brien, beating Ross, beating Jim Flynn, drawing with Jim Johnson, beating Moran, etc., just cannot match a run like that. They cannot be compared. Even if you're heavyweight champion, because people say, well, Johnson's got heavyweight champion, and he did make that historical significant thing when he beat Burns and becoming first black heavyweight champion at world. You know, that is a real legacy achievement for Jack Johnson, and he was the first. Joe Louis was the second. There wasn't another black heavyweight champion until Joe Louis, and when Joe Louis became champion, of course, that's when they got rid of coloured heavyweight title that, you know, Gaines and Obi Walker and Godfrey and all these other guys had been fighting for, you know, in the 20s into 30s. But, you know, even with a title, I'm sorry, to me, whether it's now or whether it's back then, a champion should defend against the best fighters of his era. Because otherwise, your title record, and this is why I'm annoyed at Jack Johnson, but I'm annoyed for him. I'm annoyed for him that he didn't take these fights, some of these fights, because his title record would have been way stronger. It would have been less open to criticism by people. But the fact of the matter is, he just didn't. You know, he were on a good thing. He were getting good money. He were getting good money on beating up on people, you know, like Ross and Fireman Jim Flynn and Moran. Hey, I can't fault him for that. But at the same time, I can't say that he has even matched what Sam Langford did from 1908 to 1916. It's just not possible.
Yeah, I 100%.
Sorry, I went on a bit of a rant there, but
that's what we're here for. Yeah, I 100% agree with that. I'd say also, even when Johnson was busy, like the busiest parts of his career don't match up to the busiest part of Langford's as far as high-level heavyweight fights. I don't think it's closer than his unified title reign, but. And actually, it was only unified until 1909 when he refused to defend the colored title, and the other guys started fighting for it, and they sorted all that out without him. So
yeah, that's where Langford first got it against Klondike, wasn't it? Considered for first colored champion following Johnson in 1909. But
right, like not fighting him in May. So in May, officially, he had ducked the fight with Langford. So at that point, it was up for grabs, I guess.
Do you know what gets me about one thing that got me about Jack Johnson during my research when I really delved into all these guys' careers? And he were offered $30,000 to fight Sam McVeigh in a 20-round fight in Cuba, and he totally rejected it. That were in 1915. He could have fought Sam McVeigh in Cuba. That would have been one of the great heavyweights of his era on his resume. You know, whether he won, lost, or drew, it wouldn't matter. McVeigh would have been on his resume. Yes, Jeanette and Langford should have been on his heavyweight resume in that time as well. But at least even if Johnson would have got someone like McVeigh on his resume. I mean, McVeigh were a terror by that time. He was not an easy fighter to beat, just as Harry Wills. I mean, they had 5 fights. Wills won 3 of them, but Wills also lost 2 of them. You know, McVeigh was not an easy fighter to beat. This is a Harry Wills fighting McVeigh, who then went on that absolute near 50-fight unbeaten tear for years, destroying everything in his path. You know, but he didn't find it easy beating Sam McVeigh. And Wills is a great heavyweight himself. So a very underrated heavyweight as well. I also rate Wills top 10 heavyweight all time. But, you know, this is the thing. I just don't understand where people reject Langford as a top 10 heavyweight based on all this, you know, and can rate Johnson. I mean, I rate them both top 5, mate. They're both great heavyweights for different reasons. You know, Johnson did have that unbeaten totally heavyweight champion. You know, I don't critique him for that. You know, he had a lot of fights for that title. You know, he won it against Denver Ed Martin. His first defense were against Sam McVeigh, but it were against an inexperienced Sam McVeigh. You know, his second defense, I think that was Sam McVeigh as well. And then I think his third defense was Sam McVeigh. And then I think it were it Ed Martin and Childs, not long before he lost to Marvin Hart. But yeah, it's he had an unbeaten run as coloured heavyweight champion. So, you know, all credit there, because fighting fighters like McVeigh, even a young McVeigh, was still strong and hit hard. But also beating fighters like Frank Childs, Ed Martin, they were more experienced at time than Jeanette and McVeigh, and they were tough fighters who were very experienced. You know, they were both coloured champions themselves as well. You know, as was Peter Felix. Johnson defended coloured heavyweight title against Peter Felix. He has an indifferent looking record, but he could be a tough proposition, Peter Felix.
That's true. I've seen described in one articles why they said he was widely known as one of the best guys around.
Yeah, he was a very tough fighter, Peter Felix. He has one of those indifferent looking records, but he was a tough proposition. You know, as were other fighters like Black Bill. You know, all these fighters were good fighters who Johnson were beating during that early time, but they cannot match up to the sheer insane run that Langford had during his run from 1909 to 1918. I mean, that run is almost unmatchable by any heavyweight in history.
Yeah, they were talking about like staggering levels of activity, and I just think Johnson, his like the toughness and the conditions he was fighting under, you know, stacks up against almost anyone ever, even like Jeanette and McVeigh for all the great things they did. Especially like Jeanette, you see a lot of people, even if they would fight Jeanette, they wouldn't fight him in a finish fight or even maybe not a long fight, because his strength was his cardio. So he was so hard to put away. So hard that when Langford, in their one fight that he did put him away, he said it was kind of an accident, and he laughed at Joe for jumping in the way of the punch, like it was a silly mistake on Joe's part, because he was so hard to finish. So like that was part of the dynamic of him not getting opportunity.
Another point as well. When Langford first fought Sam McVeigh in 1911, Johnson fought him, as I highlighted, in his fourth, I'm sure it's his fourth, 10th and 11th pro fights for McVeigh. When Langford fought McVeigh for the first time in 1911, he had 40 wins, 6 losses, 2 draws, 3 of those losses early to Johnson, and 38 knockouts out of 40 wins. That were a 20-round fight. Now, someone tell me that fighting that version of McVeigh, who's now amassed 38 knockouts in 40 wins and only has 6 defeats in nearly 50 fights, is the same as beating a McVeigh who's in his 4th, 10th and 11th pro fight alone. That version of McVeigh in 1911, he's been through the 1909 war with Jeanette, 49 rounds. He's fought Jeanette over 30 rounds. He's fought all these fights. He's battle-hardened. He's experienced in the ring. You know, the rounds he's boxed by this point is immense compared to rounds he'd boxed by time he faced Johnson in terms of ring experience. And, you know, that's another thing. I can't remember figures offhand, but I have them figures somewhere in McVeigh's file, I think. But I've got a thing where it shows the round experience rounds boxed through the career. I don't put this stuff on videos generally because I don't see a need to, because people kind of see how many rounds they've fought often anyway. But McVeigh's rounds experience when he fights Langford first time is immense. He's more now a veteran. He's a ring veteran. The wars, the long fights, you know, it's a much different proposition than fighting McVeigh in his 4th, 10th or 11th pro fight. Now, I still give Johnson a lot of credit for winning those fights against McVeigh, because even though he was young, he was still knocking virtually everybody out, even at that stage, who he were winning. But the fact of the matter is that were a McVeigh who was still very durable and strong and tough. I mean, Johnson only stopped him once in 3 fights. Okay, all of them were 20-rounders, and the third fight, he stopped him in 20th round. The first 2 went 20-round distance. So, you know, I do credit Johnson for beating what was still a very durable, physically strong and very, very hard punching heavyweight. But I don't give him the credit for beating the Hall of Fame version that Langford beat, if you get me, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree with that. Something can be a really good win without being a great win, or being like you know, something that you would like, you know, they like maybe like, I guess in more recent generations with the amateurs, you see some guy, you know, not everyone goes undefeated as an amateur. I know the rules are a little different and everything, but you know, but beating someone early when they're still developing is different from fighting them when they're absolutely at their peak. And this 1911 these clashes between Langford and McVeigh, these guys are in their absolute best form. There's real question, even as great as Johnson clearly was to everyone. And the only question was like, really, what would happen if he fought Langford, McVeigh, and Jeanette? And so and obviously, with them all keeping a busy schedule, they didn't all go undefeated, especially because they were fighting each other amongst that schedule. But that was really like what was there for Johnson. But he'd already been through the ringer, and he'd been denied opportunity, even holding one of the two championships. He's holding the colored heavyweight title since '03. Doesn't get anything until the end of '08. So at that point, he's 30 years old. He's been fighting since the early to mid 1890s. It's money time, and those three guys were the absolute best. He was perhaps not quite at his absolute best anymore, even though he was brilliant defensively, and he did know how to use his size. So as he got a little heavier, as he got older, he was able to use that. He was special, but maybe they were at their very, very best. Like they were still young, they had their youthful vigor, and he was maybe leaving that part of his physical prime, even though his skill was off the charts. So I guess he didn't like the risk.
Yeah, that's a good point, buddy, actually. And another point I'll put to listeners is this, and consider this, because I've spoke about these wins over these Hall of Fame heavyweights. And when we consider Joe Jeanette for a second, when Langford first fought him, Jeanette had 15 or 16 fights. Okay. When he fought him again, okay, he had nearly 18 fights. Okay. When he fought him again, he had 22. When he fought him again, he had 31. When he fought him again, he had 34. I have all this information. I've got crazy information that most people won't believe. But when Langford fought Jeanette in 1914, in his 145th pro fight, I think it was, Jeanette had 125 fights. He wasn't in his first 22 fights. And from those 125 fights, Jeanette had 90 wins and nearly 60 knockouts. So Langford is fighting these fighters when they are vastly experienced. And also by 1914, Jeanette had proved himself by beating Carponte. He'd been through the 49-round war, winning it against McVeigh. He'd already fought Langford a number of times. It was also not only, because a lot of people don't credit this as well. Yes, by the third fight, by second fight, McVeigh will be very familiar with Jack Johnson. He's fought him twice. Johnson's later style was very different. His style morphed. He became more experienced. So if McVeigh would have fought Johnson between 1908 and 1916, it wouldn't only have been McVeigh who was way more battle-hardened and experienced, were more, rounds experience in bank, but Jack Johnson would have been better and way more experienced. And I think it would have been a much better fight than their early fights. And it's the same with Jeanette and Langford. When Langford fought Jeanette when he'd had 125 fights, he's not only fighting a Hall of Fame heavyweight who's had over 100 fight experience with nearly 60 knockouts and just over 90 wins, but he's also fighting that Hall of Fame heavyweight when they've already had a number of fights against each other, and Jeanette knows Langford down to the ground. He knows how his feet work. He knows what kind of lead punches he's going to throw. He knows how he can, slip, and he just knows him by that point. So when McVeigh's at his physical peak, Langford's at his physical peak. They're very aware of each other. Whereas when Jeanette were fighting Johnson over 3 or 6 rounders, he's not really going to get to grips with Johnson's style very well because he's not experienced enough against him. By the time Langford fights Jeanette in 1914, he's fought over 100 rounds against him.
Yeah, and the footage that survived. I mean, the footage that survived is of their 10th fight. So as you see them fighting, these are two guys with a ridiculous amount of professional experience against all manner of stylists, and in Langford's case, at multiple weight classes, who know each other inside and out. So the way Jeanette approaches Langford with those like long jabs, high and low to the body, just he knows how to try to stay out of the way of the primary dangers that Langford presented, and vice versa. Langford knew what to not fall for and stuff because they'd already been through some intense wars. This is the same thing with Langford and McVeigh and all of these guys and their little trio of excellence in these years when Johnson was from the generation before. I can't remember when Jeanette debuted. Is it 04 maybe?
Yeah, I believe it was 04, yeah.
Yeah, and as far as I know, Langford and McVeigh both in 02. So Johnson, he started almost a decade before them, almost a decade. And so,
Yeah. Another
you know,
another good point. Yeah, good point again, buddy. Sorry, I'm on a bit of a roll. Another thing to consider is, unlike Johnson with McVeigh, okay, when McVeigh first fought Wills in 1914, okay, Wills had nearly 30 fights by that time. He already nearly had 20 knockouts. He wasn't fighting Harry Wills after 4 fights or 7 fights or 10 fights. He was fighting a Wills, okay, who was already relatively experienced. He'd already had a number of tough fights. So he was fighting a version of Harry Wills who was just a few years away from going on his ridiculous tear where he destroyed everything in sight virtually. You know, but he was fighting a Wills who already had nearly 30 fights under his belt and dozens of rounds fight experience. And in that fight, McVeigh, Wills over at first kind of 12 rounds, but actually most people had him ahead on scorecards by a few rounds. They thought he was just out punching and out speeding McVeigh. But McVeigh, see, and this kind of goes to my point, McVeigh switched the fight up in round 12 and he changed how he was fighting Wills because Wills were much taller and longer physically. So what McVeigh started doing is he started leaping in with lead left or right hooks. And as soon as Wills backed up to ropes, McVeigh started unleashing torrents of two-handed assaults. And if anyone's seen McVeigh launch two-handed assaults, I wouldn't really like to be on end of them. But he started literally bullying Wills to ropes round after round, and Wills suddenly were not outboxing him, he was suddenly fighting on defensive. And this is what I mean. When Langford's fighting these guys around these years, he's fighting experienced fighters who don't only have the experience fighting Hall of Fame fighters from the time, but they can also now adjust. They've gained enough experience that, McVeigh's behind on points in a fight, so he changes the style up. He starts fighting in a different way. He starts raiding Wills. And in a number of those rounds, by end of 20 rounds when McVeigh gets verdict, McVeigh has took off into a point lead. He starts dominating most of those last 8 rounds just by making that adjustment and saying, no, you're not going to fly around me fighting those hard thudding lefts and rights anymore. I'm going to start pushing you back. And a number of those rounds, Wills were on near bandy legs. McVeigh was starting to get to him, but he just couldn't get him out of there. But that kind of, again, speaks to that experience that McVeigh had at that time. So when Langford's fighting these guys between 1911 and 1916, these guys are at their physical peak. They are at the best they have been in their career. When Johnson fought Jeanette and McVeigh, they were not at the best of their career.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. We see other fighters that are not necessarily what you would say was beatable, but they're less invincible until they hit their prime, either weight or level of experience. Like Joe Walcott at lightweight was really good, but Joe Walcott at welterweight, even when he was fighting above welter, but as a welterweight, was just a monster. And other fighters like Ray Robinson, or Hank Armstrong. Like, I guess with Hank, you can kind of debate where he was best because he was so epic at multiple weights. But like some of these guys, they really do have an optimal time in their career relative to who they're fighting. Langford, his rise was so steep, and he was fighting above his weight so much that he had a lot more experience than that didn't necessarily count toward, okay, what happens in a heavyweight fight when your opponent's this big and he's not as fast, but you really don't want to get too many shots, even if you got a good chin. So Langford's rise was a little different to Jeanette and McVeigh and even Johnson. Like Langford came up through the weights, but it was to his advantage because he wasn't always the smaller guy in his career, but he did do plenty across different weights, different combinations of speed and chin and techniques and people that those guys opponents are trained under, because obviously these people associate with each other. So like Sam was influenced heavily by Jimmy Walsh, the bantamweight. There they are sparring, even though they had a size difference. Yeah. Walsh was a very high quality bantam, he was around in that thing, and you see they fight on the same cards quite a few times early in Langford's career. I think even when one of his trips to London, when he fought Tiger Smith, I think Walsh wasn't Walsh on that card. I could be wrong.
I don't know offhand. I'm not sure offhand.
I think it was on one of the UK cards. But anyway, guys would travel around, in Europe at this time. That was one of the ways Langford could get fights. When he just couldn't get fights, he could get, for a time at least, he could get some work in England. But I mean, Johnson had done that too. He went to England, schooled, I think it was Ben Taylor,
Mm.
and impressed the English there. You know, like guys would travel over there. They would do the thing. There was money there. It's a live gate era primarily, so fans wanted to see these guys fight in person. They were superstars. They were like mythical creatures. You know, the toughest of the toughest. And at
Yeah,
heavyweight, that was the marquee division.
this is now when people say this. No, Johnson wasn't allowed to fight Langford and these guys anyway, so Johnson's better. All this stuff. I just laugh at that now. I just so reject that so fast, because obviously, I'm sorry to be hardline. Well, like my channel name, I'm sorry to be hardline here. For people out there who believe that Johnson wasn't allowed to fight these guys, you're living in cloud cuckoo land. I'll tell you, because Johnson could have fought him in a dozen countries around the world at the drop of a hat and made big money doing it. You know, just like those guys, Langford, Jeanette, and McVeigh showed, especially Langford and McVeigh, more so probably than Jeanette, showed you can travel around the world and fight in a dozen countries, and you can earn big money. You can earn big money in UK, France, Australia. You know, Panama offered fights to Johnson against Langford and McVeigh. I think that were in 1915, I think. But either way, I mean, even Panama offered big money to Johnson to fight Harry Wills in 1916. I mean, that would have been an interesting fight, because Johnson he'd lost his title to Willard in 1915. But then if he'd got Harry Wills on his resume in 1916, that Johnson was still not really shot. So that'd have been a great name there. Harry Wills were calling Johnson out from 1914 to 1917. And then he kind of followed New Kid on block, Jack Dempsey, and Willard more so, saying he'd whip both of them in one night and trying to get fights for them. But, you know, that's another great name that Johnson had that called him out. And there were a fight offer from, I'm sure it was Panama, offered money for Wills and Johnson, and I think to fight in a 10-rounder, I think. But again, just this is what frustrates me, because Johnson's a great heavyweight, but he could have been even greater. You know, whether he won or lost Langford for title, or whether he won or lost against Wills, if that fight happened, whether he won or lost against McVeigh and Jeanette, if he'd have won them, his resume would have been outstandingly better. If he'd have won some of them and lost to some of others, his resume would still have been outstandingly better, even more great than it already is. So, you know, it frustrates me for Johnson, because I'm telling you right now, if Johnson during that 1908, 1915, I'll tell all listeners, if Johnson between 1909 and 1915 had beat Langford, Jeanette, and McVeigh for that heavyweight title in whatever country they fought in, I'm telling you, Jack Johnson goes above Joe Louis and maybe even Muhammad Ali to me at that point, as potentially the greatest heavyweight ever.
I would think so. I mean, it would be another whole set of greats in their primes, like a whole other generation at their absolute best.
Yeah,
you know, like, but not everyone's Muhammad Ali. You know, not everyone's like, let me just get at everybody. Give me every bit of smoke I can find.
All the work Johnson did, if you add Jeanette McVeigh and Langford as wins in Johnson's win column, in addition to fights he had for that heavyweight title, his heavyweight title reign suddenly looks way better. And Johnson, to me, would then be in contention, like I said, for greatest heavyweight of all time. Yeah, but sadly, I can't put him there. I put him fourth because he didn't fight them at that point. So,
yeah,
you know, like,
sorry, go ahead.
You know, when McVeigh fought Langford in 1911, you know, before they went on that crazy run fighting each other from end of 1911 into 1913, you know, when he fought Langford in 1911, the people out there, do you realize Langford were not only on a dozen fight win streak? Okay, he only had 7 defeats in over 100 fights. Okay, he had 7 defeats in over 100 fights, and Langford had mixed in all-time great company already, a whole number of them. But McVeigh fought Langford when he'd had, I think it were nearly 2 dozen heavyweight fights by that point. So it wasn't in his first 2 or 3 fights at heavyweight. He'd already had a coloured heavyweight title. He were already on his runs of 5 coloured heavyweight title wins. He was already experienced at heavyweight. He climatized at weight. He already had a lot of rounds experience at that weight. But McVeigh fought Langford, like I said, when he had 7 defeats in over 100 fights. So they were mixing and matching against each other at their best at heavyweight. And this is why it frustrates me that those fights didn't happen. But this is why Langford has to be given more credit as a heavyweight, than what he currently gets.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, that loss at the end of 1911, I mean, there was the newspaper decision. Jim Flynn got the close one, maybe was carried. The other two fights they had around in those surrounding years, they certainly suggest it might have been carried. But like this was that loss right there, even though it was a little contentious, or it was the draw was contentious. I'm not sure about the loss, but Langford was leading, but McVeigh was doing such great work. But that was like his first real loss since 1906. That was his first like official points loss because he had the newspaper decision against Flynn. So it was dozens. Let's see, it was 35 fights after the young Peter Jackson loss that followed the Jack Johnson loss in 06. So it was 36 fights later. He loses a newspaper decision to fireman Jim Flynn, and then 22 fights after that, he actually loses a proper points loss to McVeigh. That's the kind of success and the speed of his schedule in those years.
Yeah.
So he wasn't just some contender. He was a guy who was fighting a busier, harder schedule than the champions.
Yeah, that's very true. That's very true. And like when Langford first fought Wills in 1914, Wills had knocked out all but one of his opponents. He were on a win streak. Okay. And when Langford next fought Wills at the end of the year, he was on an even bigger win streak, okay, than what he'd been on the first time. Langford knocked him out in 14 rounds with that chilling left hook. But by then he'd already had nearly 30 fights and he had nearly 20 knockouts already. So again, Langford were fighting Wills, not when he'd had 6 or 7 fights. He were fighting him when he were experienced, had a pile of knockouts, were on win runs, were calling every Tom, Dick and Harry out. So, this is what I mean in that time. This is why when people look at the heavyweight runs that these guys had in comparison to Johnson, especially between those years I highlighted, Jack Johnson was not involved in those fight runs like that. Now, people say, well, he doesn't have to be because he's already better. Yeah, he beat a middleweight Langford. He didn't beat the Langford who'd had 60 fights at heavyweight and were battling heavyweight Hall of Famers and gaining more wins than losses. Okay. He didn't fight Jeanette, okay, who had like 15 defeats in nearly 100 fights, were like 50 plus knockouts. He didn't fight the McVeigh who only had 6 defeats in nearly 60 fights with nearly 50 knockouts. He's fighting weaker versions of them, weaker versions of fighters who were going to be the great heavyweights of the time. I mean, if you think about it this way, another way people have to look at this is if we had Errol Spence now, or say we'll keep it heavyweight, Tyson Fury. So say if Tyson Fury became undisputed heavyweight champion when he beat Klitschko, say Klitschko had WBC belt, say they put that title online and Fury beat him and he's undisputed champion. And say Fury reigned from 2015 to now, which is a similar time period to what Jack Johnson reigned. Now, to people out there, if Tyson Fury would have reigned as undisputed champion from 2015 to 2022, and he never fought Usyk, Joshua, Wilder, Parker, Povetkin, all those guys, do you think his reign would be strong enough to call him an all to credit him over, say, if Joshua fought Wilder 3 times and fought Parker twice and fought Povetkin 4 times and fought all the guys that Fury wouldn't fight? People can't tell me that give Tyson Fury all this out of world. Well, his fanboys would, but regular boxing fans, they'd be very critical of Tyson Fury. They'd be saying, well, you're not fighting Wilder. He's number 2. You're not fighting Joshua. He's 1 of 3. You're not fighting Povetkin. You're not fighting Usyk. You never fought those guys in your entire reign. Tyson Fury would get ripped left, right from Sunday. But when it comes to Jack Johnson, they say, oh, well, they don't have to, we beat them. It's just the get out clause. It's like the cue card. I'll pull my get out of jail free card. Oh, I beat Langford as a middleweight, so he didn't have to fight him when he's an Hall of Fame heavyweight.
I've had people bring that up, and I just say, well, he signed a contract to fight him, so it's a moot point whether or not should he have fought him. He was actually signed to fight him, and he pulled out of the fight. He also turned down 3 offers to fight in the U.S. around that same time. I think it was Boston, Philly, and New York. Different length bouts for the 3 fights, but he backed out of 1 fight and then turned down 3 others. He wasn't going to fight Langford. He didn't have any interest in that fight at that point in his career. I don't know if that means he didn't think he could beat him or he just didn't want to take the risk, because Langford was a pretty scary dude. Everyone had to be wary of that power. Yeah. Even like someone like Jeanette, the the Iron Man, you know, he had to be really careful. And guys late in Langford's career, when he really had no business fighting, he was still a real threat. He was. It was only the last couple years when he was basically just completely blind. He was just, you know, that he wasn't like still like a huge danger. But
I mean,
sorry, go ahead.
like, yeah, absolutely true, mate. Yeah, like I've said, I would love to be able to call Jack Johnson the greatest heavyweight of all time. And if he, like I said, if he'd bet McVeigh, Langford, and Jeanette during that run, if he'd have gone to Paris and fought Jeanette and beat him over 20 rounds, because Jack Johnson, actually, a lot of people may not know this. Scrapbook will have heard of this, okay, but most people won't know this. Jack Johnson was offered a fight to the finish against Joe Jeanette, and he flatly refused. He said any fight against Jeanette has to be over 10 or 15 rounds only. He flatly refused to fight Jeanette in a finish fight. And
Yeah,
the
I've seen
reason
that
for that
myself.
is
Jeanette
Jeanette
issued
was,
that challenge after the finish fight with McVeigh, if I'm not mistaken. That was at
yeah,
least one of the times he wrote a letter, you know, and he was, you know, he was very eloquent, you know, like Langford wasn't as educated, but like, you know, McVeigh especially, like he gets the idea of a bruiser, but he liked poetry and museums and he played piano and guitar. He's an educated person, you know, he's a cultured person, you know, once he had some money and he was traveling. So the image of
yeah,
these guys, like they were dinosaurs. They weren't all dinosaurs. Johnson himself, you know, Langford was
the
probably
point.
the least
I need to
educated
get
of
my
the
point
lot.
out 'cause I'm going to forget.
Sorry, brother.
If I may, the point I'm making is when he fought Willard, he were knocked out in 26th round. That wasn't the last round of the fight. He would fight Jess Willard in a 20-plus round fight, but he wouldn't fight Jeanette in a 20-round fight. And Johnson himself said at one point in one interview I read, he was asked about the other heavyweights, and he gave Jeanette massive. He always gave Joe Jeanette massive credit to Jack Johnson. I mean, yeah, they'd have spars here or there in media if they were going at each other. But when they spoke to him, like kind of off the record and more calm, he always gave Joe Jeanette incredible respect. And he actually said he's not keen on fighting him over 20 or more rounds because no matter how much you hit on him, no matter how much you can get him buzzed and hurt him, he just keeps coming and coming and coming and never stops. And I think the 49-round fight with McVeigh, where Jeanette went down over 20 times, okay, and came back and started beating McVeigh up from round 33 to 49. He started pushing McVeigh back and unloading on him on ropes, hitting him with multiple uppercuts. I think in 37th round, he pushed him to ropes and smacked him with 3 right uppercuts on trot. And McVeigh was suddenly struggling to survive. You know, I think that fight taught Johnson that, well, if I fight this guy over 50 rounds, I'm never going to get rid of him. You know, after 35 rounds, he's still going to be coming at me. And, you know, those are long fights. That fight in Paris 1909 went 3.25 hours. There were over 20 knockdowns in it. And McVeigh was he wasn't as technically refined as Johnson. Johnson was like a grandmaster in ring at that point. But McVeigh was way more powerful and way more explosive. Johnson more were judging range, muffling your work as you came inside, hitting you with lead shots, left hooks, right uppercuts, straight rights as you came inside. When you got inside, he'd tie you up, he'd bend your arms, he'd physically sap your strength. McVeigh were very different. In 1909 fight, in early rounds, Jeanette were having good rounds where he were boxing, he were hitting him with jab, catching McVeigh with rights. And then suddenly, McVeigh had come out in next round and just start throwing a fierce two-handed assault, dropping McVeigh left and right, Jeanette left and right. And then after a round or two of assaults, McVeigh had calm off again. Jeanette had started establishing his boxing again. And then a few rounds later, 2 or 3 rounds later, McVeigh had again go at him. You know, so McVeigh had a very different style to Johnson, even though McVeigh had a very clever left hook. He was very good with his left hook. When he got more experienced, he could get them left hooks in, and those left hooks had concussive force. If he leapt in one of them left hooks, a bit like a la Barbados Demon Joe Walcott left hook, where he'd leap in with left hook, and if he just caught you on chin, he'd just knock you out. You know, Walcott as well used a big arching overhand right. That's what he finished Choyinski with after battering him in early rounds, and Choyinski kind of steadied him mid rounds, but then Walcott, you know, finished him off. But, you know, slightly different style. Very different style, McVeigh, but a very hard fighter to deal with, just as Jeanette was a hard fight to deal with. I just think that Johnson, it frustrates me because he is such a great heavyweight already. It frustrates me that I can't rate him higher. You know, that's one of the things about it that frustrates me. You know, when I look at Harry Greb's career, he didn't have a period where he wouldn't fight the best fighters. So my critiques of Greb are way less because he kind of did everything you could expect of him. You know, one idiot told me once, he dodged Harry Wills. I'm like, I'm not even paying attention to that ridiculousness. Wills is a 235-pound heavyweight. You know, 165-pound middleweight. He's not expected to fight Wills. If he does fight Wills, I'll give him all credit in world. I don't see Harry Greb winning that fight at all. Wills is too long and rangy, too hard hitting and too fast, too strong on the inside. But, you know, ultimately at the end of the day, he's not expected to fight him. But Johnson or like a Britain or like a Canzoneri, I do expect them or hope that they do fight the great fighters in the time, because it only makes their legacy that much greater. If Johnson would have bet them at Vaisjanet and Langford, he did, and he'd have bet the later better versions. I mean, really, could anyone fault Jack Johnson for really anything? It'd be hard to critique him in any way.
And I think it's worth mentioning, BL. I mean, some of the regulars, shout out to the chat. Sorry, I'm not really answering anyone. I see you there. Big up, Scrap. But it's worth noting that, you know, Langford, Jeanette, and McVeigh not only fought each other, so they not only fought the best in the world, you know, minus Johnson, who didn't want to be involved at that point, from that point on, but they also fought a whole heap of contenders. So they weren't, like, there's a lot of overlap between Johnson's schedule as the world champion. So, like, you know, what was it? So Tony Ross, Jack O'Brien, Stanley Ketchel. How many overlapping opponents with Langford from his title reign? Battling Jim. So the ones that Langford didn't get to fight was Al Kaufman, who drew the color line on him.
From his, what do you mean, the heavyweight title reign? It was,
and then obviously Willard, who he lost to, and Frank Moran. Langford never fought Moran.
Yeah, Jack O'Brien, Ross, Ketchel, battling Jim Johnson. He didn't match Moran or Willard.
Or Jeffries. So he fought 4 of the 7 opponents that Johnson fought.
Yeah.
And he didn't get to fight Tommy Burns, although he called him out. He just couldn't get the fight. Interestingly, I found an article from 1908. Like, I knew that they were booked for the the National Athletic Club in London. They were booked for February of 1909, and it got moved to May after Johnson got the Burns fight. But I saw an article in 1908 where it was said that Johnson had given up on getting the fight with Burns, and he was going to train for his fight with Langford in London in September of 1908. So I've got to dig more on that. I hadn't heard about that booking until maybe a couple months ago. So I definitely got more book, but that time period's getting a little bit ahead of where my real focus is as far as like the book I'm working on. But I have studied it because the footage from Langford's from around that time. So I had to dig, but I still have a lot to go on the full drama between these great fighters, you know, Johnson and Langford, in this drama that lasted basically the entirety of Johnson's reign and a little bit afterwards, and also a little bit before the unified part of his reign. And it really was something that, it was a rivalry, but it was a time when Langford could fight the kind of schedule that would keep him at the front. Where today, if you don't fight, you might be the contender, but if you're not active, then other people take over and gain ranking. So Langford was fighting the toughest schedule and being successful at it in this time when Johnson was the champion.
There were another incident in 1911 where, again, they were trying to get a Langford-Johnson fight made. And Johnson and Langford's team and Johnson were going at each other in media, doing rival interviews in rival newspapers. And it's fascinating when you sit and read them all. And you read all interviews, and Johnson were cursing Langford out and his team. And we're going to take this fight. I'm going to, beat on that boy and all this other stuff he was saying. And then he was sent a bout agreement and just refused to sign it. Johnson just won't sign it.
Yeah, he wasn't keen on that stuff.
And this is frustrating for me. This is what frustrates me. I don't want fighters doing that, because these are great fighters we're talking about. And people out there can nitpick these fighters for these reasons, which is another reason why I don't like the great fighters to do that. The great fighters we look at and respect and revere so highly, they very rarely do that. And Johnson, one thing I want to say about Johnson to people out there is, don't underestimate his career before he won the title against Burns. The period we're talking about, 1908, 1915, the period from 1916 on, when he was leaving his prime and he was just getting old, okay? But the period before that, when he's fighting Griffin 4 times and Klondike 3 times and Choinski and Martin and Childs and Felix and all these other guys. They were tough guys, okay? I don't want people to think that Johnson's earlier career were no good and his title reign is weak. Johnson fought some major fighters, some very hard, tough fighters in his career prior to winning title against Tommy Burns. So
that's right. And he fought guys bigger than himself and smaller
people are
than
listening
himself.
thinking, "Also, Johnson didn't do that much." No, I don't want to portray that. He did a hell of a lot, and that's why I rate him 4th greatest heavyweight of all time. Okay, just below Ali, Lewis, and Langford. But
I think it's a good
yeah, I just
shout.
want to get that point in. I don't want people thinking I'm saying he did nothing. He did incredible. He has an incredible career.
Right. These are just some of the fighters, some of the multiple fights, some of the fighters that he faced before facing Langford in 1906. So this was 2.5 years before he actually unified the colored heavyweight title and the formerly, exclusively until that point, the white heavyweight title. But he, Hank Griffin and Jeanette and McVeigh and Denver Ed Martin, Black Bill, Marvin Hart, lost close decision to Marvin Hart, Frank Charles, Klondike Haynes, Big Sandy Ferguson, George Gardner, light heavyweight champ, Joe Choinski, lost to Choinski, and young Peter Jackson, who himself fought above his own weight. Jackson fought Langford a bunch of times, but he also fought Johnson. So some of these guys were they were willing to give up size. Not everybody was. A lot of guys were very concerned with size, weights, and weigh-in times and things like that. Langford was a little bit on the other end, like the extreme other end of the spectrum, where he after the nonsense with Joe Gans, like not getting the title shot in 2003, winning the fight but not getting the title over 2 pounds over the ringside weigh-in weight of 138, and then losing the opportunity to fight Gans for that same title because he couldn't make 138 the next year in 1904. So after that, like, he wasn't that big on weight cuts and this stuff. So that's partly why you see in like 1905 he's fighting, go ahead and fight middleweights, fight Joe Jeanette at heavyweight.
I mean,
then it gets crazy.
Another thing about Johnson as well, what people again shouldn't underrate, is he fought a lot of other good fighters who never get mentioned. Jim Scanlon, who Johnson fought in 1901. He was a big puncher. He had 24 knockouts in nearly 30 wins. He only had 4 defeats in over 30 fights. Billy Stift, again, who Johnson fought in 1901. He had nearly 40 fights. Okay, and he also was on having some good fight runs. So it's not only the major names like the Hank Griffin. He was a big puncher. First 2 fights Johnson had with him. Hank Griffin had already had a lot of fights, nearly 30 fights, just over 30 fights, and he had a lot of knockouts in those fights.
That's right. Reportedly, he had a lot more fights than the ones that he claimed to have had hundreds of fights. So we don't actually know, some of these guys, just how busy they were. In this time, there was a lot of fights in private that weren't reported.
Also, other fighters like Joe Butler, who were former coloured middleweight champion. When Johnson fought him in 1903, he had over 30 knockouts. He was a very experienced fighter. He had nearly 70 fights or something. So prior to him winning title, having the title gives him that legacy and that achievement, first black heavyweight champion. And the title reign from 1908 to 1915 is great, but it could have been even greater. But yeah, I'm really wanting to stress even other fighters like Mexican Pete Everett. When Johnson fought him, he had 25 knockouts in 27 wins. Johnson had to fight 20 rounds against him. Mexican Pete Everett, again, was not a blowover. He had a number of defeats, but he was a tough, experienced fighter. He'd had dozens of fights, and he had a lot of knockouts. So a lot of those other guys, what people do when they look at, you may know this, Randy, yourself, and Scrapbook will definitely know this, because even I do it in some of my videos. I focus more on the known names. But when you actually know the resume of a fighter and you know the fighters on it, when you actually dig deeper, there's so many more better, dangerous fighters on there. If you're fighting a guy who's got 25 knockouts in 27 wins, he can punch a bit. When you fight him over 20 rounds, this is Johnson's career when he's before his physical prime. This is just after, not long after the Choinski loss. And Choinski himself, he had nearly 70 fights. He had nearly 40 knockouts. He's a Hall of Fame light heavyweight.
And he was a great fighter, and he would help other people prepare for fights, as did Johnson.
Yeah,
Johnson
exactly.
helped at
But
least. I had said one or two live streams ago that I thought he was helping Tommy West. It was actually he was helping Twin Sullivan get ready for a fight out on I can forget against who, and they were bringing in some guys. But Johnson helped people prepare, as did others, and Choinsky was one of those guys. Jeff Clark's another.
yeah, absolutely.
Bob
But when
Armstrong, certain
people,
guys, they could really train you. They could really corner. George Byers was considered a better corner than a fighter, and he was a really good fighter.
well, he was first fighter to win coloured middleweight and heavyweight titles before Sam Langford emulated that in the following decade. George Byers were coloured middleweight
Incredible.
champion, and then he won coloured heavyweight championship in 1890s, and then that feat wasn't repeated until Langford also won the coloured middleweight title and coloured heavyweight title in the 1900s. But when people look back, George Byers were a fantastic fighter, a really, really excellent fighter. Now,
There's Byers in the
the
upper
point,
left. That's from a 1905 newspaper clipping I did. And in the
yeah,
middle,
yeah.
that's a well-known photo of him. Here he is
But
with actually, real quick, here he is to the right, to our right of Sam Langford, standing next to Bob Armstrong, who's also a colored
yeah,
heavyweight champ.
yeah, Bob Armstrong, another one. But when people look at Johnson's earlier career prior to Burns, they always say this. You'll hear them many times, and even I do it because sometimes you don't have time to go through everything. But they'll say, "Oh yeah, he lost to Choinsky, he lost to Hart, he beat Martin and Childs, and George Gardner, all this." George Gardner, another fighter, he only had 3 defeats in nearly 50 fights. Okay, Johnson beat him on points over 20 rounds. George Gardner, fantastic light
He was an
heavyweight fighter,
excellent
but
fighter. Yes, he
they,
was.
they never mention, right, the fight series were Black Bill. He had few defeats when Johnson fought him. He were experienced. The multiple fights for Sandy Ferguson. The multiple fights against good punchers like Hank Griffin, Mexican Pete Everett. Okay, the multiple fights were Klondike Haynes. He not only fought all the major fighters people mentioned, but he fought a lot of other really good or tough fighters like Joe Butler I mentioned, and all
That's
these other
absolutely
fighters as
right.
well. So
I should mention also, Biel, that this chart here, this is just some of the notable opponents he fought leading up to the fight with Langford in the middle of 1906 season. So this isn't like all the notable opponents. Like this doesn't even get into other guys. But between the two of them, they had some shared opponents. And like at the time when Langford was chasing Johnson, one of the things you could do that I think Johnson, a lot of guys have tried to do is you try to beat everyone in contention, of course, that you can get to, but also beat everyone that the champion has beaten. So you start to get a similar looking resume, and then the press will start cheering. Well, like, let's find out who's actually the best. But Langford, by the time, like we referenced 1911 fighting with Vey, here are some of Langford's notable opponents leading up to, this is a crazy chart right here. It took forever to put together in OBS, loading one photo at a time, BL, and then lining them all up. But this is leading up to the fight with Bill Lang in early 1911. These are some of Langford's notable opponents he'd fought. Some of those are more famous than others, but there's some, common opponents with Johnson already. Big Sandy.
yeah, absolutely.
Young Peter
I'll
Jackson.
just take a second random to shout the people out in the chat. Martin Dunstan, Haplo, TFM, and of course Scrapbook Boxing. My boxing brother himself. Big shout out, Scrapbook. Hope you're well as always. I just wanted to shout those guys out. But yeah, when you look on that image you've got right there, they are many great fighters of that time. Johnson fought a whole number of them. I mean, Jack Blackburn, rather, to me, foolishly by this time, because I think Blackburn wouldn't have beat Johnson at that time, but he was calling Jack Johnson out for a fight because he did not like Jack Johnson. He wanted to fight Jack Johnson. I've never found the article that covers the sparring where Jack Blackburn bust his nose with his left jabs, but I've never found the account of that. I've heard that story, and I've tried to verify that story that Johnson were trying to move in on Blackburn, and Blackburn were pinging him, because of his speed. He were pinging him with left jabs, because he had a great left jab. Hence, he trained Joe Louis, who, guess what, had a great left jab. Funny coincidence.
When Langford fought him, Blackburn was like a lightweight / maybe a small welter, but like he put on weight later on in his career. He was a little bit chunkier.
He was at welter at time, and he was demanding a fight with Jack Johnson at one point. Incredible. I mean, it's cartoonish, but Blackburn was serious. He was deadly serious.
Yeah, well, Langford gave it a shot. Ketchel was heavier when he fought Johnson than like Blackburn would have been, I guess, but Johnson was heavier as well. Like, yeah, it's some of the guys, the guts they had, but there was also good money available, so it was having guts and also being willing to go through hell to get paydays. That's what Langford had to do, like to get opponents. Like, yeah, he could get them at heavyweight, but not always. But like, say another common opponent with Jack Johnson, Bill Lang. Langford fought him. We have footage of that fight, partial footage. He gave up like 30 pounds to Bill Lang. Fought him in London in 1911 as part of a busy season and spanked him around the ring for 6 rounds until Lang fouled out. It was easy to foul out in London this time.
The story, I have to say,
just part of a season.
I have to say, mate. Yeah, very true, buddy. Yeah. Oh, you see, you've got me on this topic, and I keep going on rolls. I'm sorry, but I'm really passionate about, especially this time. But like I'm all boxing history, but this time I sometimes launch rants. So if I'm going on a bit, buddy, I do apologise. But it's one of my favourite periods. But the thought of now a welterweight like Jack Blackburn now calling out a near 190-pound heavyweight champion. I mean, now it'd seem cartoonish. And now fans would say, well, Spence will never call out Joe Parker or Usyk. I mean, come on, that's ridiculous. But these guys were doing that. Blackburn wanted to fight for coloured heavyweight title. He challenged Johnson. And I've searched high and low for that article. Confirmation of that. I've heard that story many times that, Blackburn, because Johnson would often use smaller fighters in sparring. Like he later used Harry Greb in his sparring session. And he said Greb was the fastest fighter he'd ever seen. He couldn't even tag him clean. He couldn't catch him. And Blackburn, he often used smaller fighters if he were fighting a quick opponent or a quick-handed opponent. He'd use smaller fighters to adjust to that speed. But yeah, Blackburn were after him. And Blackburn was serious. I mean, it's cartoonish, but this is just what fighters did. And Langford himself, he challenged Johnson, actually got the fight as a middleweight, weighing 156, challenging a 180-pound plus coloured heavyweight champion.
It's absolutely incredible. Here's Blackburn in the lower right, folks. He was as hard as he looks. He got that scar in a knife fight with his brother, I think Fred. But he just told the police it was just a disagreement. I mean, he was a hard man. He went to jail for shooting people. Blackburn was from a hard time, and he was a product of a hard time, and he was rock hard even for that time. So.
Oh yeah, he was
calling
serious.
out Johnson. I'm not surprised. He was a dead serious dude. You can see it in the photos later with Joe Lewis. Blackburn looks as serious as he was. Like, he's not someone who has a resting bitch face.
He always had a knife in his pocket. He always had a knife in his pocket, and apparently
carries straight razor. Yeah, he was a serious guy.
But Scrapbook will know this story. Some other people may not. I know we're getting off topic. I'll get back on topic in a moment. But just to fill people in on who Jack Blackburn is, yes, he trained Joe Lewis, and people. I was talking on a channel the other day, 86's channel, and this guy was saying, back then they had no technique. Well, Joe Lewis, who became heavyweight champion in 30s, who people say, wow, look at his style, look at his skills, look at his technique. People, he was taught those techniques by Jack Blackburn, who fought in the 1900s and 1910s.
That's right, and patterned in no small way after Langford.
Where they say these fighters had no technique prior to 30s and 40s. Really? Well, how did Jack Blackburn train Joe Lewis all those techniques? Did he just invent them all out of thin air? It really aggravates me. But one thing to show you how Jack Blackburn were respected, people have heard of Sugar Ray Robinson, no doubt. Okay, Sugar Ray Robinson was always trying to be around Jack Blackburn. He always wanted to be around Jack Blackburn. In fact, he used to try and go fishing with him because Jack Blackburn loved fishing. Robinson used to, in gyms or where they met up, he used to try and go on fishing trips with him just so he could spend that one-on-one time with Jack Blackburn. So we're talking about a guy who was highly respected, like many fighters from, and I'm really going off topic, I shouldn't go off topic. But you know what I mean? It just shows who some of these fighters are. They were not only revered in their time as the great fighters they were revered by fighters in future generations. Sorry, another little BL rant right there.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. And, Blackburn thought the world of Langford. And I'm sure that a lot of how Lewis was molded, even though he was a larger person, it certainly was in no small part on Langford's ability, because he was the wonder of that generation of well, practically 2 generations because he started so young and fought so late. But he was like the exception to the various rules just because he hit so hard. And like I've made this point. I think it was on a live with Haplo or 86, one or both. But the biggest hitter of each generation, the hardest, most concussive puncher, is not necessarily the big guy. In lots of generations, that's not the case. Rocky, Fitz, and it was like that with Langford. So even Johnson said he couldn't hit like Langford. He said he had a wicked uppercut, though. He could tear a guy up with it. But he said, yeah, I can't hit like Sam. Everyone knew that. No one hit like Langford. Once he hit his, about what, 175, it was scary. It was already scary, but once he hit like 175, now it was scary to like big heavyweights, people of any size. He was just such a tank, and he was celebrated as such. And that's probably part of why Johnson didn't necessarily want to fight him, because when he fought him, he wasn't very experienced against big fellas. He became a specialist in beating up big guys. So Johnson was a big guy. He might have wondered the stuff that worked on all these other fellas if Langford had the solution, because Langford had, by the time Johnson was the champ, Langford had more experience than Johnson, at least in known fights. But both may have had fights off the books. But Langford had gigantic experience, and that was part of the problem for the various white hopes, who the four kings, we could call them, of that era, were all beating at different times, as well as sometimes fighting each other. The problem was they just didn't have the experience. And in later generations, you see fighters go for that. Like by the late teens and the 20s, you see lots of fighters trying to pile up these incredible seasons. Look at Dempsey's couple seasons leading up to winning the title. Fight busy. That they learned that from guys like these guys, and also like Joe Gans, George Dixon, some of the greats of the past who kept a furious schedule. Keeps you sharp. Greb's one of the best examples of that. Not even really the way he fought, not really a stopper, even though he had quite a few finishes out of almost 300 fights. But it was that he could, he just had so much experience. He was such a well-oiled machine that even like you said, BL, didn't he break his hand, fracture his hand in 1919?
Three times.
And still win 45 fights. So it's like maybe he's not sitting on his punches, but he knows how to win fights, and that experience.
You can tell when you look in 1919, because when you look at the calendar and the dates of the fights, in the second half of the year, he's had so many fights in first half, but in second half of the year, you see 3 or 4 week periods when he don't fight. That's when he's recovering from his broken hand. Although when he broke his hand on one occasion, he did take a fight 3 days later, and he fought the whole fight and won with a broken hand. He just said, "Oh, it'll be all right. I'll hit him with the other one." What he said, "No, I'll beat him up with my other hand." So that's mentality you want. But
these guys were real hard cases.
Yeah. Just to answer a point from Haplo in the chat, though, he's asking about Schmeling and Joe Louis, the weakness. Now, Johnson did play on that a lot, that he alone came up with it, but Johnson did highlight that Joe Louis were making a flaw in his defense, that when he jabbed, when he extended his left hand in his jab and he pulled it back, it dropped. So he'd be wide open for right counters after he jabbed. And if you watch that fight, that's what Schmeling's doing. He's waiting while Louis jabs, and then he's throwing straight right hands, straight following it, and he starts catching him. And then as rounds go on, he starts hurting him, catching him cleaner. But it was Jack Blackburn himself, and this goes back to Johnson and McVeigh and Jeanette and all these other fighters, Langford. I think it was Jack Blackburn who said, in early, 1940, 1941, he did an interview, and it would Joe Louis were pretty much the topic interview. They wanted to know how Joe Louis were doing and how we were developing and stuff like that. I think I've told this story before, but Jack Blackburn said, "Yeah, Louis is real good now. I've refined him. He's learned a lot." He famously said Joe Louis was like a sponge. That when he came to him, he were very ungainly, he were very powerful already, but he didn't have the right balance, the right technique, everything. His poise, his positioning just went on, and that's what he worked on to refine his style and tighten his style up and mold him into what he molded him into. But Jack Blackburn said, when he were asked, is Joe Louis greatest heavyweight of all time? I'm sure it was Jack Blackburn who said, Joe is real good and Joe's great, but he's not a match for the black heavyweights of my time.
Yeah, and Johnson actually expressed similar opinions himself. He said that him and and Langford and some of the other guys would have eaten Joe Louis up. You
Yeah,
know,
Jack
obviously
Blackburn.
these fighters have such confidence in themselves, but he wasn't the only one thinking that. There was a lot of discussion about, they were already calling them old timers then, you know, by the, say, the 20s and the 30s, especially, you know, the guys from the aughts and teens, these are old timers, but they were hugely respected. And this, you know, so the questions of could Gans or Georgie Dixon or Langford or beat guys, you know, their counterparts from the teens and 20s, that was a big topic for discussion. This,
And
you know,
the thing about it, in reference to Joe Louis, because a lot of people go into this like ad hominid, how dare you say that Joe Louis is no match for them heavyweights? But a bit like Haplo when he was apparently on a channel debating, and someone was saying anybody who rates Benny Leonard over Roberto Duran is insane or stupid or whatever. And Haplo asked him, "Have you heard of Ray Arcel?" And he was like, "No." And he said, "Well, he said Benny Leonard's better, and he trained both of them, so he should know." You know, Jack Blackburn said, you know, he said that Joe Louis wouldn't beat the black heavyweights of my time. Jack Blackburn sparred with Johnson. Andy fought Langford a handful of times, so he knows those fighters. Andy knows his fighter intimately, so he knows their strengths. He knows Joe Louis's strengths. He knows their weaknesses and Joe Louis's weaknesses. So this ain't just someone saying it carte blanche. This is someone saying it who has vast experience of both sides.
right. It's an informed opinion that certainly should be taken with more seriousness than just random people saying what they would like to be true. You know, because it's, you know, there's always a difference between myth and fact, but just the verifiable parts of some of these careers are fantastic. And, you know, Joe Louis, along with Ali and Langford, like, to me, Joe Louis is well, I have him a top 2 heavyweight. I'm just not sure between him and Ali. There are different arguments for both, but Louis was more dominant, but Ali fought in a richer era. So how that balances out, I'm not sure. But Langford has like the largest heavyweight resume. Let me think. How many did you estimate he had? About 190, was it?
204 heavyweight fights, so he had about 112 non-heavyweight fights.
Yeah, so we had more heavyweight fights than Louis and Ali combined, which is crazy.
Yeah, with Tyson thrown in, added on top, and
actually, he would have had more heavyweight Hall of Fame fights than those guys combined as well, wouldn't he?
Yeah, he's had over 50.
It's absolutely stunning. Like going through his record, like as I have, like I've been studying 1902 to 06 for my book, but you know, when you get to the end of 03 and he's already had like at least 29 fights, and you go into 04 and he has another 14, and then in 05, it's just like, how do you top that? Will you go to middleweight and light heavy and heavyweight, and then it just gets sillier and sillier, and Langford's career it doesn't ease up until, gosh, like 1921 or something, maybe, or 22. Like, it doesn't, and I don't mean not being busy, but I mean as far as like the high level fights, because even as late as 1920, he's fighting some dudes. I guess when he has that last fight with Wills, after that, it's not so much. But, you know, Langford was a special case, and he weight jumped, but like Tiger Flowers tried to do the weight jump on an old Langford, and it didn't go his way. You know, Langford was still dangerous when he was old, and if you were smaller than him, that could be a bad night at any point. He just hit too hard, you know. You can block it and still get hurt if a guy hits hard enough, you're not of appropriate size.
Yeah, or it can bust your arms and make you drop your arms. One thing about, I once had someone come at me and quoting Rocky Marciano rates higher than Langford as a heavyweight. When I told him that Langford had more fights against Hall of Fame heavyweights than Rocky Marciano had professional fights, and explained that one, I never heard from him again. I just said, well, 35 or 36 of Rocky's opponents are not really that quality. You know, you've got Savold, tough, experienced contender. You've got Rex Lane, who were a very good contender. People totally underrate him on Rocky's resume. You've got Lastaza twice. You've got all the other fighters he beat. But Langford had more fights against Hall of Fame heavyweights than Marciano had professional fights. So that shows you right there, the level of work he did at heavyweight.
And you know, separating factor that makes it hard to compare them directly or like in any way that's favorable to Rocky, because it's just he did so little by comparison. Not that he did so little in an absolute sense, but by comparison, it's like it's like you might be tall if you're 6 feet, but if you're standing next to a guy who's 8.5 feet, you're not tall anymore. You're relatively short, and that's what these resumes start to look like compared to just the bizarre schedule Langford kept. somewhat
yeah,
out of
it's
desperation,
ridiculous.
but he still kept it.
It's ridiculous because if you times Rocky Marciano's career total by 4, he still has had way less fights at heavyweight than Langford. I mean, that is how ridiculous that comparison is. And people say, you know, oh well, he beat Charles Walcott and Moore, and they're all-time greats who are better than fighters that Langford beat at heavyweight. Really? So you think that Archie Moore is going to beat Harry Wills easy? Let me tell you something. If Archie Moore fought Harry Wills, right, he's getting knocked out. Archie Moore's a great fighter, but he's not beating Harry Wills. Not
Yeah,
easily, anyway. I know he
that's a
could beat
tough
Nino
fight
Valdez.
for Moore.
I know he could
That's a
fight
tough.
other guys, but Harry Wills ain't Nino Valdez. Okay,
Right.
for
You look
start.
at the run Harry Wills went on in his prime, like he was
Yeah.
destroying people. He was
And
absolutely vicious, and he was big. He wasn't like Langford, like overcoming size. He was one of the big guys. He had the range. He had
yeah,
the massive range and reach.
and this is what I mean. People, before they make these silly comparisons, they have to learn who the fighters are first. Because if you say that, well, Charles Walcott and Moore are way better than Wills, way better than any fighter Langford fought. If people again think, right, that Archie Moore is going to batter Sam McVeigh, right, you are living on cloud cuckoo land. The problem is with these kind of comparisons, I'm going to get off Marciano Langford because I'll go into a super rant. It irritates the hell out of me what people say, disrespecting other fighters. But those guys ain't beating Wilson, Jeanette McVeigh and Langford easy. I'm very sorry. And people say, oh, Archie Moore, he'd destroy Langford. Langford's too small. Langford destroyed and knocked clean out way bigger men than Archie Moore. Langford is going to laugh in Archie Moore's face. He's not going to have any fear of Ezard Charles or Walcott or Archie Moore. If you put Langford in ring with Lane and Savold and Cockle and Lastaza, Langford is going to destroy those guys.
Yeah, I agree. I think stylistically, at his very best, Moore is harder for Langford than or Charles would be harder for Langford than Rocky, just because, you know, if you think about the Jim Flynn fight, the footage of the drills in London where Langford's doing that push off drill, you know, he could literally do like the kid brother, like basically push off of Rocky's head and then hit him with the other hand, and he wouldn't be able to reach his body or his head. Langford just had that bizarre build that he would know how to use it against someone who wasn't super slick. But like, you know, Moore's combinations and his cleverness and Charles would be good fights, but they wouldn't be scaring Langford. He would be completely fearless. He fought way more scarier dudes than them. They were brilliant, but like scarier dudes, you know, like size counts. They weren't particularly enormous. Langford could hit. It wasn't like normal hits. It was like Joe Louis hits, like you hit and the guy just drops in agony. Although I guess Wills and Fireman Jim Flynn and others said Langford hit so hard they didn't even feel it. I think maybe Foreman said that about Shavers, or Ali might have said that about Shavers, one of them. Hit so hard that you don't even feel it. It's crazy. But for a little guy to do that is to me is just, you know, extra impressive to be able to, because Lewis was quite a bit larger than Langford, larger frame, and he was heavier and taller. But man, you know, but how the individual styles line up, I'm not sure, you know, with like the various greats, because, you know, it comes down to fight IQ. We know Langford had a very high fight IQ, and like Ali had that sort of uncanny sense of timing and distance, but he also had like the death punch like Lewis. So he was like, because of his specific attributes and his experience and the circumstances he came up in, he was a special case. Johnson knew that. By the time he won the title, he knew that Langford was his main rival. He'd fought him before he had hit his like heavyweight prime. He hit him when he was just getting into heavyweight, and even though he won, he didn't. You know, the crowd was cheering Langford in that fight because he was impressed everyone by not dying basically in the ring, not, you know, lasting all the way the distance. So they were cheering him. I doubt Johnson enjoyed that either. So as Langford's myth grew, by the time Johnson had beaten Tommy Burns, like, you know, it probably didn't seem that appealing to a fighter who was getting a little bit older. 30 wasn't young in those days. Maybe for a couple fighters, I'm not sure. You might know of some BL who were prospects in their late 20s or something, but for large part, if I'm not mistaken, you know, it was much earlier guys would start. Certainly was true for Langford.
Yeah, it was very, very much so, because, you know, back then jobs were hard to find for a lot of people, and those people who, you know, were amateur boxers or were looking to boxing, they generally didn't waste too much time getting into pro game, because when they're in pro game, you know, they can start to eat, they can start to earn money. And the better they do, the more money they can make. So back then, times were very hard, much harder in some ways than they are now. I mean, times are not easy now for people. But back then, if you didn't fight and win, you just don't eat. You know, it's as simple as that. So a lot of guys, you know, they'd learn the technique and they'd be thrown into pro ranks fairly quickly. You know, some fighters had what you could call amateur careers. But generally, you know, they travel around through different gyms and training camps and spar different people and learn the craft that way a lot of time, you know, and then they just go into pros and start their professional careers off, you know. But even when a number of fighters had turned pro, some may not have even had amateur fights, but they'd spent a lot of time traveling around with other champions or other fighters, getting a lot of sparring with different fighters in different gyms and different training camps. So, you know, they didn't turn pro, a lot of them with no experience. You know, a lot of them had an amount of experience fighting a whole number of different fighters of different sizes, different styles. But you know, yeah, it was certainly a tough time. Oh God, I don't know, I pressed something weird there. Yeah, so yeah,
it was. You see Langford's come up, you know, like 3 amateur fights that we know about in 02, 1 pro fight, and but then the next year, starting in January, you know, after 5 or 6 months off, maybe a little more, you know, he comes in and it's like at least 28 times he's in the ring that year. He gets 1 loss, and then at the end of the year, Jack Blackburn gets a win in spirit, but it's a prearranged draw. But he got the best in the majority of rounds, and you know, so like this time, just like with Langford in it wasn't prearranged, but just like Langford the next year getting a draw against the great Barbados Walcott, you know, so you could win the majority of rounds and not come home with a victory. It's just how it went sometimes in those days. But his 1903 was crazy. So, I mean, he's already an experienced fighter in fight total and rounds in the ring by the end of his first full season, although he's not at his best and he's growing. So he never really hits like a lightweight peak. I guess he hits the peak for the season. He beats Gans and then holds his own against Blackburn, getting a little bit the worst of it. But
yeah, then he has to go to welter soon after, because he already came in overweight for a Gans fight, which is why title went online. So he was denied.
Right, and then at welter, but he's like, right, exactly. So, you know, he fights Dave Holly, who's just a quality lightweight, very, very clever guy, fought himself a tremendous schedule and a lot of fights against tough characters. But you know, he stops Willie Lewis, who went on to do some big things, to be a notable fighter. He stopped Tommy Sullivan toward the end of the year. He was a welterweight prospect at the time. He was undefeated, as far as I could tell. He stopped. It was supposed to be a good fight. You know, he got the best of him. You know, Andy Watson, he finally got the win over him that year in 04, and he's growing. You know, and but then in 05, it just starts to get silly. That's when he really starts to weight jump. And then, as you know, like by 07, he goes to England to get fights at one point, and then in 08, and he's going out to California to get fights. Like, he had to move around just to find willing participants. But luckily for him, this was a crazy time when lots of guys wanted to make some money, and the money and the alternative meant that he still could get top fights. Just never got that title fight after the. Well, he did fight for the title against Barbados Walcott, and he had an opportunity twice to fight for the title against Joe Gans, but he couldn't make the 138 ringside, which is pretty crazy. Like, 133 is a weight class. Yeah, they're going to fight above the weight, but he got to weigh in and go fight. So nowadays, you know, if you're fighting at 135, you're definitely stepping into the ring at more than 138. You know, I don't think they'd have to go up a weight class or two if they had to do ringside weigh-ins these days. Same thing in mixed rules, mixed martial arts. Almost everyone cuts weight. Some of the heavyweights don't, of course, but a lot of heavyweights, medium-sized heavyweights, cut to MMA's version of light heavyweight, which is 205 pounds, approximately cruiser. So there are a lot of guys who are plenty. They're as big as the top heavyweights. Some of them, they just cut that weight. So it happened in this time, just not as much, because the weigh-ins would be day of, sometimes right before the fight. It's pretty wild. You know, have to be in that kind of condition and be able to make that weight. So I'm sure that affected people's performances. But Langford, he solved that problem by just fighting larger men than himself. just forgetting about the weights. He wasn't the only
And
one though, as you
and
know.
everything we've discussed here is, I'll just let you know, this is why, because a lot of people don't realize, this is why I refuse debates on YouTube with people who want to debate Marciano versus Langford or Joe Louis versus because they just don't know the era in this way. And when people don't know era in this way, what is the point of having a discussion with someone? Like, we're having a discussion now, but we both know that time. What is the point in me having a whole discussion with someone, who doesn't even know the era that well, or the fighters who fought in it, or the fighters' records, or their opponents? They just as a little side shot in there. This is why I just don't debate on YouTube. The only thing I've ever said I'd do on YouTube is have not really a debate, but me and Scrapbook could have a really deep discussion like me and you are having now. No doubts, certain other people can hold their own, but this is why I don't really have these discussions with other people. That's why, recently I had to tell someone, sorry, I'm not going on and doing a top 10 heavyweights on your channel. Because I've already done it with you on Scrapbook, and it was very deep, and I'm content with that. I don't feel a need to do it anywhere else. You two guys I see as my co-panelists. The only other channels I go on, Haplo if you have me on there, but not with any idiots, as he already knows, and certain other people. But this is just what I mean out there, people, listeners. It's to know this era, like me and Random are talking about, you have to really study the era and the fighters. You have to look at the records. You can't even gain an understanding of what went on in this time and the fight runs these guys were on and who their opponents were. You have to research that before you can genuinely match a fighter against a fighter from any era. You have to know both sides very, very well. And whereas I know the fighters from the 2000s, the 90s, the 80s, the 70s, the 60s, the 20s, the 1900s, you have to do that really to rate fighters against each other, which is why on my project, I felt comfortable doing that because I know Langford's resume and I know his opponents and I know his fight runs and his schedule, and same with Jack Johnson as well. A lot of people couldn't do that kind of breakdown if they don't really understand that era. And I'm not saying anybody out there's at fault for not knowing that era that deeply. But, this is why I don't go on panels where they're discussing eras where people only know rudimentary information about them. I want a deeper conversation like we've had today, like we have when Scrap's with us. I want those kind of deep discussions. I'm not interested in superficial conversations where someone says Johnson made 8 title defenses or 9 title defenses, depending on which version you believe in. All this other stuff, I don't care about that stuff. I like to go deeper. That's why I don't join any of the panels except my man Random. And thank you, buddy, as well. I'll say thank you to you on air. Because right from off when we first met, when you were Best of MMA, before you change your profile, you've made your channel available to people like me and Scrapbook to come on. I just want to say a big thank you for that as well. You deserve a lot of credit for that. And
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
From when you were first commenting on my channel, you have developed so much. I'm so proud because you've grown so much in a short space of time. And, given another 5 years, you'll be in mine and Scrap's position where these kind of low-level conversations, not like we're having now, but low-level conversations will no longer interest you because you've gone way deeper than that now. You have a way deeper understanding. So like me and Scrapbook will do, we'll look for people like Scrapbook did with Curtis Anderson. May he rest in peace. I never really got a chance to speak to Curtis Anderson. But, I did tell Scrap I'd have been very open to join him and Curtis on a live stream. I think that'd have been a fantastic live stream, me, Curtis Anderson and Scrapbook. This were a little while back. I said this before I heard a tragedy. But that's what I mean. Me and Scrapbook go looking for people. We look to connect with people who can speak and have a discussion on a certain level. And absolutely. A lot of people don't understand why I don't interact on other platforms. And this is why. Because other people can't discuss with me, other than Scrapbook, yourself, a few others. They can't have a discussion with me this deep at this level. And this is the kind of conversation that interests me. And some people don't understand.
It's definitely more gratifying, my friend. Like that's why I've enjoyed so much working with as well as you guys, Josh from 86 Boxing, and the talking to Haplo has been a pleasure. More recently, just guys who know quite a lot. So you're going to learn something if you talk, and you can also discuss common points like bring it round to like, so like this is Langford's 1905. You know, there's like the famous opponents, so like the opponents that people may have heard of, like Jack Blackburn, someone might have heard of him, Joe Jeanette. But you know, guys like young Peter Jackson, Larry Temple, even George Gunther. Like you look on BoxRec, he has a certain record, but reportedly he came over with several dozen knockouts in a row when he came over from Australia. So you look at BoxRec and see Langford fighting him, and he hardly has any fights. But that's just on BoxRec. That's not necessarily all he'd ever done in his career. I don't know if there's a strong record of his Australian fights, but he was a somebody when he came over. So that's a fight where being able to beat him would mean more than it would seem like at a casual glance, even if someone just looked it up on the boxing websites. I usually look at BoxRec, then I go look at Cyber Boxing Zone because they have a different. Sometimes they have better records, less information per fight, but better records for the early era, the early gloved era. But combination of those is pretty good. But knowing, like, say, young Peter Jackson, you know, his fights with Jack O'Brien and these guys, he was a prominent fighter. He was actually managed by the same manager who represented Joe Gans, the great Joe Gans, the Baltimore Demon, young Peter Jackson. The guy was a dead serious dude. And
he would Sim Tompkins at his best were a formidable fighter to face. You know, he fought Johnson for coloured heavyweight title, went the distance with him. He has multiple stoppage wins over Hall of Famers. He were a two-handed puncher. He had a physique like marble. He were a very strong fighter, very physically strong fighter, very durable, could knock you out with either hand. He was a formidable fighter to face. You know, he goes very underrated. I've long paraded that young Peter Jackson should immediately be put into Hall of Fame. As well as other fighters like Jeff Clark and a whole number of other fighters from that era, other fighters from later era, Lou Salica. Yeah, young Peter Jackson is one of those should immediately be put into Hall of Fame.
Yeah, in fact, there's a few guys just in his 1905 season that deserve at least consideration for the Hall. Dave Hawley, George Cole, young Peter Jackson, Jack Blackburn. All four of those, as fighters, make a pretty good case for themselves, considering some of the other inductees, without being negative about anybody, but there are inductees who've done less in their careers in like hard fights and hard wins than they did. So, and they had big careers. So, you know, but
well, yeah, I mean,
I'm sure there's politics involved in that, like everything.
A lot of people may not realize Dave Holly, who you mentioned there, the loop puncher. And I wish I could see the punch. I've read many times it described. It's hard to picture it. But he used to come in close, then he would bend his arm, then punch upwards and twist while he were doing it. It's very hard to imagine unless you actually see it.
I've been trying to find out myself, BL, if I can just interject, because I saw a report of Langford hitting, I forget who it was, maybe Jim Barry or someone with loop punches, and I was like, wait a minute, what is it? And I haven't been able to find, but I'm actively searching now. Okay, please continue.
Yeah, just quickly before I get back on Wally, what you need is one of them old like artist depictions in paper showing how to punch. That's how maybe scrap across something like that. But I've read it described many times, and it's a punch that caught many people off guard. But when Langford first fought Dave Holly, it was 1904, I believe, midway through 1904, roughly. Oh no, sorry, it was 1904 towards end of year, wasn't it? If I remember. Am I thinking at wrong time?
Let me see. April 11th, about a third of the way through the year.
Yeah. He fought Dave Holly and he lost over 10 rounds. Now, a lot of people say this as well. They say, oh, fighters before 1940s didn't have technique. Well, the thing about Dave Holly is he fought with a version of a shoulder roll. This is in 1904, because when he was fighting Langford were employing his hard left jabs. Langford had a very good jab at those lower weights, and he would use a ramrod jab. And Dave Holly were getting pieced up by jab over the first 2 rounds. Langford took the first 2 rounds. But then Holly, as described in the newspapers, started lifting his left hand to protect his chin, lifting his right hand to protect his chin, bending down to his right, and moving backwards, which is where he said his left hand was, and his right hand cupping his chin, and equivalent of a shoulder roll. And then what Holly started doing is he started backing up, and then Langford started following him. And as Langford followed him, Holly were firing straight right hands and left hooks to body and lead left hooks as Langford came into him. He were fighting with an earlier version of a shoulder roll.
I've
And
seen
from round
reports
3
that
to 8,
mention him
Langford were all
protecting
over.
his chin with his own
Yeah,
shoulder. I've seen it describing Langford's style as well later, but like, yeah, Holly, that was one of his things. Like he had that intelligence.
Yeah, Holly started out boxing Langford. Then in round 9 and 10, Holly suddenly switched it up. And instead of backing up defensive, he was suddenly coming forward, throwing multi-punch combinations at Langford. And Langford, by this time, we're all at 6. He's been outboxed over a number of rounds after winning first few. And suddenly the guy who's backing off and he's trying to tag him and trying to work out how to get shots on him, suddenly that guy's walking into him and delivering lots of body shots and then going up to head. But this version of Dave Holly that Langford fought, he only had 12 defeats in nearly 90 fights. You know, Langford, even at that age, is fighting a very experienced fighter and a very excellent fighter who has nearly 90 professional fights. He's fighting a vastly experienced fighter who's mixed in really good company, and Langford lost that 10-round point decision. And he came back with that, if I remember it, were Elbows McFadden, who Langford got rid of in a few rounds straight after that, and then he went into a Walcott fight, if I recall.
Yeah, but then 2 more fights against Holly, then Andy Watson, then Tommy Sullivan, Jack Blackburn, and Joe Reed to close out the year. Like it's bizarre. But you know, with Holly, he fought. You know, Langford was a sponge too. He was learning, so like he improved on his results. He fought the 15-round draw in Baltimore, and then he got a 6-round newspaper win in the no decision, city, Philadelphia. But the year following, let me pull this up here. He gets the win over Holly, and I believe it was that fight in February 13th. He knocked one of Holly's teeth out. He gave him a good beating, and he was still growing, so he was actually larger. I think he had about 10 pounds on Holly in this fight that they had in 05. Langford was starting to grow, and I mean, you see it. He's fighting some serious dudes. Like, young Peter Jackson was no joke, and certainly Joe Jeanette, even early in his career, was a dead serious character. He wasn't a pushover just because he was new. He was a heavyweight already, and Langford was just still a little dude.
Yeah, when Langford fought young Peter Jackson first time, again, Jackson had over 50 knockouts. He had over 100 fights. He was a very experienced fighter. So you're fighting a hard two-handed puncher who has great endurance, great stamina, good work rate, and he has over 100 fight experience. That is a hard fight.
And then Langford,
third full season as a pro.
Right, and so like Langford closes out the 05 season. He loses to Jeanette over, it looks like 8th round TKO in Lawrence, Massachusetts, which is a little bit north of the city of Boston. But then he's back at the end of February fighting again, knocks out Larry Temple, and he fights Black Fitzsimmons, and Joe beats Joe Jeanette. And then in April 5th, April 26th, so 3 weeks later, after winning over 15 rounds against the great Joe Jeanette, he fights Jack Johnson. He loses over 15 rounds. A few days after that, he spars a few rounds with Johnson at a benefit for the victims of the California earthquake. Then he has an exhibition with Black Fitzsimmons. Then he loses to young Peter Jackson, takes some months off. When he comes back in November, that was when he begins that massive run that went all the way to 1910 against Flynn with a newspaper loss, and then all the way to the end of 1911. I mean, it's just dozens and dozens and dozens of fights where until the McVeigh, and even the McVeigh loss was a close one. So just a huge span of work where he was so much of a problem for the guys he was fighting. And you see the smaller opponents start to fall out of his schedule from 1907 on, where he would give up to size to guys, but they weren't so keen to be smaller against him because he was the one who could already punch above his weight. So let me see if I have 1907 here. I'm actually gonna have to jump off in a couple moments here, BL, unfortunately. We should do this again. Yeah, so 1907, he's just, now he's like, he's really starting to hit his I don't know if it's his heavyweight prime, but he's certainly, like, for his size, he's one of the best in the world, if not the best. And then just gets, and this is all before Johnson beat Tommy Burns. So Langford, so you see that I don't think I have my 1908 loaded for some reason. That's an error on my part. But by the end of 1908, another undefeated season for Langford, if I'm not mistaken. So like he had just a big run of being victorious, and so Johnson not taking the fight. It wasn't some normal contender. This was a guy who had proven himself great over and over again.
Actually, just to fill other people in on some information there, just to give people an idea. In that run that we were speaking of earlier, Jack Johnson, 1908, so end of 1908 to 1915, he had those run of fights we mentioned. Sam Langford had nearly 70 fights in the same run and had twice won and lost the coloured heavyweight title. And in that 70 fights, had made 28 coloured heavyweight title defences and literally had nearly 24 fights against Hall of Famers.
Yeah, it's
in that 1908, 1915 run.
Absolutely stunning. Well, I hope we can do this again soon. I actually have to go, unfortunately. It's been so much fun talking. Time flew away.
I've got to crack on with Tommy Loughran's stat book and Emil Griffith's stat book and Ike Williams' stat book. So,
yes, wonderful. Well, folks, I'll leave you with a picture of Sam Langford landing his famous or infamous left hook on Bill Lang, the larger man, but not the larger puncher. And I just hope that everyone got something out of the discussion. It's been a pleasure, and I see everyone in the chat. And yeah, BL, maybe we do another one. It doesn't have to be on this particular subject, but it definitely can be. Yeah, we didn't even scratch the surface of Langford's career. We mostly just talked about with some exceptions, leading up to 1906, and barely got to 1908. So yeah, let's do this again. We'll talk in the back about when we can set this up. But thanks for joining us, folks. Check out BL's channel, Hardline Boxing Talk, and look at boxinglibrarian.com, where you can find out more information, see it in the written word. Any last thoughts, BL?
No, just big shout out to everyone in chat. Martin Dunstan, Scrapbook, Apollo Type Zero, Apollo, another of my friends on here. So big shout out to everyone. It's been a great chat, and I hope the great discussion we've just had, wider discussion as well, but specifically on what we came for, Johnson Langford. Hopefully, we've gave a good breakdown and many of the reasons why. To back up my point on my video I made, that Langford can go Bud Johnson as a heavyweight, quite realistically, and the reasons why. And I'd just like to say thank you to Random for hosting this chat, and thank you to everyone for listening.
My pleasure. And Haplo in the chat there, he said he wants for his super chat, he's looking for the Ike Williams and the Duran book, if you would be so generous.
Ike Williams will be doing it next 3, Duran will be doing it next 10. Just a quick word, when I'm doing my stat books now, I would just pick him initially, but I thought, well, no, why not start at top? So if I get bored after 500, I've done all major fighters, so I'm starting at top of my ratings now, and I've got a list of alt names and in order of the top 1,000, and I've inserted a column, and I'm putting in there when I've done the book. So I'm filling the gaps and I'm traveling down. So I will get to Duran a bit later. I'll get to Ike Williams in my next 3, Duran in my next 15 after that. But yeah, I will. I'll send you both of those upload, Ike Williams and Duran, as soon as they are finished. I'll send them. I'll send them when I've done each one. The Duran one will be done a bit later, but you will get both over next month.
Oh, fantastic!
Well, but next few week, I'm doing like 3 a day at a minute. So
man, and folks, just if you want to read more on Langford, like in rather high depth, Claymore's excellent book on Sam Langford is definitely Boxing's Greatest Uncrowned Champion. Is definitely a read, and that's actually the aforementioned Bill Lang there on the canvas, halfway going through the ropes at the hands of the tiny Langford. He looks so small. Because he was in every dimension except the chest and his heart. The man had some he was a special case, and he also had physical attributes he was able to capitalize on to multiply his dangerousness. So he had a lot of stuff going for him, but he also put that work in, and his schedule shows that. So we will be back. Check out future content for both of us. Also, Scrapbook Boxing Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs, 86 Boxing.
Yes, absolutely. Everyone should go to Scrapbook's channel. As a matter of course, if you're a boxing fan and you want to learn anything about boxing history, you must go to Scrapbook's channel and subscribe. To me, it's Scrapbook's channel, and the content on it is almost becoming like a Bible of boxing on YouTube, because that's literally what it is.
Absolutely.
You can learn so much, not only about the careers and who they fought, but the backstage stories, the stories around fights, the stories around you can just learn so much there. If you're willing to put the time in, you can get to almost, dare I say, random, almost to professor level if you learn all scrapbooks material.
If you could study all those thousands of videos, you'd be in a great spot. Hey, and last plug I'll make, folks, if you're interested in hearing boxing discussed as a season, I actually did a countdown with Biel. It might have been our first project. We did Sam Langford's top 5 toughest seasons. We had some overlap. It wasn't complete overlap. And you can find that on my channel. Just search for that. That was a lot of fun. And that sort of kicked off the series that we've done now with Scrapbook in '86. So this is just wonderful. And I've got a talk coming up with Haplo at some point in the near future about the structure of mixed martial arts compared to the current structure of boxing. So look for that and just have yourself a wonderful day. And I think I'll just leave it with I'll leave you off with a photo here with the picture of the great finish fight in April 1909 between Jeanette and McVeigh, probably two Langford's key rivalries during his prime, certainly during his prime. So have a great day. Take care of yourselves. See ya.